Crucifixion was one of the most brutal execution methods of the Roman Empire. More than just a punishment, it was a display of power, a tool of social control used to instill fear and submission. For the Romans, the prolonged suffering of the condemned wasn't just a side effect. It was an essential part of the sentence. Golgotha, known as the place of the skull, was strategically chosen for these executions. Located outside Jerusalem's walls along a busy road, crucifixion served as a clear warning. Anyone who defied Rome would end up there, hanging between life and death. That day, 3 crosses were raised. In the center was Jesus of Nazareth, a man who, to some, was just a Jewish agitator. To others, the promised Messiah. Around him stood a mixed crowd, curious onlookers, silent followers, satisfied priests, and indifferent soldiers. Among these soldiers was the centurion, an elite officer responsible for ensuring the execution went smoothly. He had been part of many crucifixions before. To him, it was just another order to carry out. But what he didn't know was that this day would go down in history. The crucifixion of Jesus wouldn't be like the others. Something extraordinary was about to happen. To understand the impact of Jesus' crucifixion on the centurion who pierced his side, we first need to understand who this man was. A Roman centurion wasn't just an ordinary soldier. He was a leader, a battle-hardened man responsible for commanding about 100 soldiers. His position wasn't granted by nobility or luck, but earned through merit after years of service, proving himself ruthless, disciplined, and loyal to the empire. These officers played a crucial role in the Roman army. They ensured that the emperor's orders were carried out with precision, without hesitation, without question. They were trained to be relentless, especially when dealing with insurgents. After all, an empire like Rome wasn't held together just by the size of its army, but by the terror it inspired. The centurion in charge of Jesus' execution was a man shaped by violence. To him, crucifixions were routine, just another day on the job. He didn't see faces, didn't see stories, only condemned criminals and orders to be followed. Other people's pain wasn't a reason for compassion, but a tool for control. And that day, he would do what he had always done: make sure the sentence was carried out to the end. What he didn't expect was that something, for the first time in years, would break through his indifference. For a soldier accustomed to brutality, seeing prisoners writhing in pain, begging for their lives, or cursing their executioners was nothing unusual. Crucifixion was designed for that, to extract the maximum suffering before death. But Jesus was different. He didn't plead for mercy. He didn't scream in despair. He didn't curse the soldiers who nailed him to the cross. On the contrary, he showed compassion. The crowd mocked. The religious leaders laughed. The criminals beside him shouted. But he, in the midst of unbearable pain, prayed for those who condemned him. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Unthinkable words for someone in his position. For the Roman soldiers, it was unsettling. They had seen many men die, but never like this. Never with this serenity. Never with this mercy. The centurion, who until then had watched everything with the cold detachment of a man trained to ignore human suffering, began to realize that this execution was different. Who was this man? Really? A silence started growing inside him. But the moment that would change everything was still to come. The Roman Empire thrived on order and predictability. War, politics, even executions followed a pattern. But on that day, something broke the pattern. Something beyond human understanding happened. At the moment Jesus took his last breath, the sky went dark. It wasn't a passing cloud, and it wasn't just the sun setting. Darkness covered the entire land for 3 hours. What should have been an ordinary midday turned into a sudden, oppressive night. The air grew heavy, and the silence that followed wasn't normal. It was a silence filled with something even the soldiers couldn't explain. Then, the earth shook. The ground split open, rocks shattered. The temple in Jerusalem, a sacred symbol for the Jews, had its veil torn from top to bottom. A detail that couldn't be ignored. Something was happening. Something big. For a people who believed in signs and omens, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning. It was a revelation. The soldiers at Golgotha felt the weight of it all. Fear began spreading among them. What was supposed to be a routine, execution was turning into something far greater, and in the middle of it all, the centurion watched. He had seen Jesus' calmness in the face of death. He had heard his words of forgiveness, and now he was witnessing nature itself bowing to this moment. Something inside him began to crumble. The certainty he had lived by until that day started to fall apart, and then everything stopped. The body of Jesus, once full of life and authority, now hung lifeless. But the impact he had didn't die with him. On the contrary, it was at that exact moment that something broke inside the centurion. Until that instant, his life had been ruled by a single logic: power and submission. He saw the world as a game of force. Rome was supreme because it ruled through fear. He, as a centurion, existed to enforce that order. Obedience was his law. Violence was his tool. The strongest always won. But then, he saw a man die in a way he had never witnessed before. Jesus wasn't a defeated man. He didn't succumb to the terror of the cross. He gave himself up, not as a weak man, but as someone who was in control until his last breath, as someone who chose to suffer for something greater. This was inconceivable to a Roman soldier. By Rome's logic, Jesus should have begged, he should have resisted, he should have cursed his enemies, but he did the opposite. He forgave. What if true power wasn't in strength? What if real authority wasn't in the sword? This was the centurion's great crisis. He had spent his life believing the world followed a simple rule. Those with power rule. Those without it obey. But Jesus proved that logic was wrong. Jesus had no armies, no wealth, no weapons, but he had something that even Rome couldn't destroy: truth. And that truth shook the centurion to his core. At that moment, he knew. He knew that Jesus wasn't just another condemned man, not just another rebel, not just a man. He was the Son of God. This realization didn't come from fear. It didn't come from superstition. It came because, for the first time, the centurion saw something he had never seen before. A man who, in his death, was more victorious than any emperor in his glory. And then, he spoke the words that would echo for eternity. Truly, this was the Son of God. This wasn't just a statement. It was a confession of transformation. If Jesus was the Son of God, then everything the centurion believed about power, justice, and authority was wrong. And this brings us to an even deeper question. What happens to a man who discovers that his entire life was built on a lie? How could he continue being the same after this realization? How could he return to the army and keep serving an empire that had crucified the very Son of God? This is the question that leads us to the next point. The consequences of this revelation for the centurion. From that moment on, nothing could ever be the same. The life of a Roman centurion was built on certainties: who commands, who obeys, who rules, who submits, who lives, who dies. Everything was calculated, predictable, and maintained by Rome's power. But now, the centurion had seen a man die in a way no one had ever died before. He had witnessed events that defied logic, and he himself had confessed, truly, this was the Son of God. If Jesus was the Son of God, then Rome didn't have the absolute power it thought it had. The empire he served, the military force he enforced, the order he helped maintain, all of it was under a higher authority. And what does a man do when he realizes his loyalty has been given to the wrong side of history? Christian tradition suggests that this centurion may have been one of the first Gentiles to believe in Christ. Some ancient accounts identify him as Longinus, the soldier who pierced Jesus' side with the spear. It is said that he left the army, converted to Christianity, and became a follower of the very faith he had once helped oppress. But even without a definitive record of his fate, one thing is certain: he could never be the same again. Someone who sees the truth cannot go back to blindness. Someone who recognizes the Son of God cannot keep living as if he doesn't exist. The centurion may have lost his position. He may have been persecuted. He may have faced doubts and inner struggles. But the transformation that began that day was irreversible. And this brings us to an even deeper point: the connection between this experience and the resurrection. If Jesus was truly the Son of God, then his death wasn't the end. The centurion had witnessed the moment when everything seemed to be over. But what if it wasn't? Imagine a man who has spent his entire life believing that success and power are achieved through force. He built his identity around this belief. He learned that to survive, he had to be tough, that the world does not forgive the weak, that only the strongest win. Now, imagine that this same man witnesses something that shatters all his certainties. He sees someone who did not fight to defend himself, who did not resist violence, who accepted suffering without retaliating, and yet still emerged victorious. This man watches everything unfold and thinks, this doesn't make sense. How can someone win without fighting? How can someone conquer without dominating? How can someone have power without using force? This man is the Roman centurion. He grew up in a system where authority was imposed through fear. He was taught that the strongest always win and that a man who dies on a cross can be nothing but a failure. But now he hears news that completely challenges that logic. Jesus has risen. The man he saw die is now alive. If this is true, and he saw with his own eyes that Jesus was dead, then everything he believed about the world was wrong. It's like someone who has spent their whole life believing that money brings happiness. They work endlessly, step on others to climb higher, sacrifice everything for wealth. And then, one day, they see a person who has nothing, yet is completely happy. That kind of shock destroys their belief system. They realize they spent years chasing the wrong thing. They can't live the same way anymore. Something inside them has changed. This is the centurion's dilemma. If Jesus truly rose from the dead, then life isn't just about power, war, and control. There is something greater. There is a kingdom that is not built with swords, but with grace. There is a God who does not rule by force, but by love. Now the centurion must make a choice: continue serving an empire that kills the innocent, or follow the one who even conquered death? This isn't just a religious choice. It's an identity shift. And here's the core truth. Jesus' resurrection doesn't just prove that he was God. It destroys the logic of the world. It declares that true power is not in domination, but in service. That real strength is not in war, but in love. That ultimate victory is not in crushing enemies, but in sacrificing for them. This is the reality the centurion now has to face, and this is the same reality that we must face. If Jesus truly conquered death, then life is not just about survival, it's about finding a greater purpose. And this leads us to a crucial question. Why did Jesus have to die? What does this sacrifice truly mean for all of humanity? That afternoon, before a mocking crowd and weeping disciples, Jesus took his last breath. His body, fragile and torn, hung from the cross. The one who had healed the sick, raised the dead, and challenged religious leaders now seemed to be defeated by the very system he denounced. But what was really happening at that moment? To the Jews, crucifixion was a scandal. The promised Messiah could not die like a criminal. To the Romans, it was just another execution. But in the heavens, that moment was the climax of a divine plan set in motion since the foundation of the world. Jesus' crucifixion was not an accident of history. It was not a miscarriage of justice or an unexpected tragedy. It was a voluntary sacrifice. Jesus himself predicted his death. He knew he would be betrayed. He knew he would be handed over to the Romans. He knew he would die on a cross. But he also declared something no one expected. The Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. Mark 10:45. In Jewish culture, the concept of sacrifice was well understood. For centuries, priests had offered lambs in the temple as atonement for the sins of the people. The blood of these animals symbolized purification and forgiveness, but it was never permanent. Year after year, new sacrifices were required. Jesus offered himself as the final sacrifice. The cross was not just an act of human injustice, it was divine justice being fulfilled. The Bible states that all have sinned and are separated from God. Sin is not just a moral failure or human weakness. It is a real barrier between man and God. But on the cross, Jesus took upon himself the guilt of humanity. At that moment, a divine exchange took place. He took our condemnation upon himself. He received the punishment that was ours. He died so that we could have life, and this truth was confirmed beyond all doubt 3 days later when the tomb was found empty. The resurrection proved that the cross was not the end. If Jesus had only died, he would have been just another martyr. But by overcoming death, he proved that his sacrifice was accepted by God and that the way to reconciliation was open. The cross became the symbol of something far greater than suffering. It became the symbol of redemption. From that moment on, anyone, Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, strong or weak, could have direct access to God. A temple was no longer needed. A priest was no longer needed. Continuous sacrifices were no longer needed. The price had already been paid. And this is the deepest truth of the crucifixion. It was not a defeat, but a victory. It was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new chapter for humanity. It was not just a historical event, but a turning point in the relationship between God and mankind. This is why, even today, the entire world bows before this event, because the meaning of the cross transcends time, cultures, and nations. And the first testimony of this transformation came from an unexpected source: the very Roman centurion who pierced Jesus. His experience represents something much greater. It proves that even the hardest of hearts can be touched by this truth. And this brings us to our final reflection. What does this centurion's declaration mean for the world? The Roman centurion's declaration at the cross was not just a passing acknowledgement. It became a milestone in the history of the Christian faith. Truly, this was the Son of God. These words did not come from a disciple. They did not come from a prophet. They did not come from someone who had followed Jesus from the beginning. They came from a Roman soldier, a man accustomed to brutality, trained to follow orders without question, an officer serving the empire that oppressed the Jews and ordered Jesus' execution. And yet, he was the first to publicly recognize that Jesus was divine. This teaches us something profound. The message of the cross is not for the perfect, the religious, or those who already have faith. It is for everyone. If someone like a Roman centurion, a soldier of the empire, a man who had lived his life without any connection to Jewish faith, could recognize the truth of Christ, then no one is beyond transformation. This means that God can reach the hardest heart, the most skeptical, the most distant. The cross makes no distinction of class, culture, or past. It is proof that all can be redeemed. Rome thought it was eliminating a threat. The priests believed they were silencing a problem. But at the moment of Jesus' death, even one of the soldiers executing him was compelled to admit that he was who he claimed to be. The significance of this is immense. No matter who tries to erase the truth of the cross, it always rises again. No matter how many empires rise against Christianity, faith continues to grow. Jesus does not need anyone to defend him. His presence, his impact, and his resurrection speak for themselves. Up to that moment, Jesus had been recognized primarily by Jews. The prophets of the Old Testament spoke of a Messiah who would come for Israel, but now the first to declare his divinity after the crucifixion was not a Jew, it was a Gentile. This shows that God's plan was always global. The gospel was not just for one people or one culture, it was for all nations, all people, all times. The faith that began with a small group of persecuted disciples spread into the heart of the very empire that tried to destroy it. And over time, even Rome itself would bow before the cross. Conclusion. The impact of this declaration today, the centurion's words still resonate to this day. They show that no one is beyond the grace of God. They prove that the truth of Christ is undeniable, even to those who try to ignore it. They reveal that the gospel is universal. It does not belong to one group, but to the entire world. And this is the great message of the crucifixion. Jesus did not die just for the righteous, but for sinners. He did not die just for those who loved him, but also for those who crucified him. The centurion was just the first. Since then, millions have bowed before the same truth. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. God bless you and your family.